Sports Radio.
Here comes the siren. I want to go higher. Oh, my goodness. He's doing a drive. Deep left field. No doubt about it. Posey will defend. Oh! LeBron James with no regard for human life.
Pass is intercepted at the goal line by Malcolm Butler. Unreal.
Oh, baby, for sure.
Cabin Sports Radio starts now.
Welcome along to Cabin Sports Radio, brought to you by Sport North, moving sport forward. Check out sportnorth.com for more about them, our wonderful sponsors. A turbulent week in the world, let alone the sports world. And man, if you thought sports was already playing second fiddle to everything else going on with regards to COVID-19, enter racism. The focus of the main focus and continuing to be the focus around the world and of tonight's episode of Cabin Sports Radio. Joined, however, by Unbreakable Mike Gibbons. Good to have you back, sir. How you doing?
Good, man. And yourself?
Doing all right. The weather is pretty cruddy here today in Yellowknife. As you know, we had a beautiful weekend weather-wise, and when the weather is nice here in the north, we don't really think about anything else. We just think about taking advantage of that beautiful weather while it lasts. But the weather is cruddy again as of Monday, June 8th, so why not? Let's talk some sports. What do you think, Mike?
Let's do it, baby.
Lots going on, obviously, as I talked about off the intro, and as I talked about last week on Cabin Sports Radio. The fallout, the protests, and everything else continues. The conversation about racial inequality and how that needs to change continues. And the sports world, perhaps because, and I alluded to this a little bit last week, because of the lack of distraction with regards to ongoing sports, really taking center stage on this one. We heard last week from a number of African-American athletes and commentators in the media who it just seemed like yesterday was a time that we needed to, as hosts of this show, basically step aside and hear from the people who have had these lived experiences with racism, the kind of thing that you and I, Mike, we've benefited from white privilege all our lives. We've never had to deal with being discriminated against based on the color of our skin. We are obviously thankful for that, but lots of people have for way too many years and have been forced to be silent about it for one reason or another. And it felt like last week, we talked about it a bit before the show, it would have felt very disingenuous to just do a regular sports show and just talk about, what was going on with the NHL playoffs, golf, what was happening there. It just would have felt a bit silly to shift gears that hard. So we took an episode to just focus on basically what the entire world has been focusing on for the better part of the last 2 weeks or so, and lend our platform to those voices that needed to be heard from and continue to need to be heard from now more than ever. I don't know how you felt, Mike, taking a week off. I know you felt the same way going into last week. What have you seen, over the past couple weeks that has affected you the most?
No, I agree entirely. And I remember when you reached out at the time, I kind of felt really the same way, just processing everything. And it did feel, as you alluded to, pretty disingenuous to then come on and start talking about what's going on in the sporting world, which really has taken second fiddle. It's not as important as what's going on in Minnesota right now, in Washington, D.C., and now throughout the entire United States, and even beyond the shores of the United States as well, where there are now peaceful protests for the most part happening in other countries around the world, including Canada. There'll be a Black Lives Matter march here in town tomorrow afternoon. So we're seeing this global movement now of people looking themselves in the mirror. And if you're in the Black community, you have faced these prejudices, this different forms of racism their entire life. And you and I have not. So I think what we can do as members of the non-Black community is just to be allies at this point. And we're not immune to any of what's going on in the States. We're not immune to any of that here. There are deep forms of systemic racism and racial inequality that happen here, even if we don't want to admit it. But whether it's with the Black community or other people of color, certainly the Indigenous community here in Canada, who are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, whether it be jails or courts throughout the country, and they are just as prone to forms of racism as the Black community is in the United States and in Canada and elsewhere around the world. So I think what we are seeing now, and it'll kind of be the theme for the first half of our show, is how prominent people within and beyond the Black community are responding to the murder of George Floyd, because that's what it was at the hand of police in Minnesota. So you're seeing very, very prominent members in the sporting world react to it in certain ways, whether it's joining protests in their city. There have been lots of NBA players certainly traveling to different parts of the country to join peaceful protests, or whether it's speaking out against racism or making very sizable contributions, whether it be financial, to organizations that are helping the Black community right now. So just still really processing everything, I think, as everyone else is. But I think as allies, the number one thing we can do right now is listen and learn from some of these lived experiences with racism that have been going on really forever now.
And the nice thing is that, I mean, obviously, this sort of discussion is never brought up organically out of nothing. Something horrific always has to happen to readdress this conversation. I don't know if it's because we just think that, you know, if nothing horrible has happened, if there's been no recent racist incidents within the past 2 weeks that we've heard about, that it must have gone away, it must not be a thing anymore, or if we just forget. But there have been multiple incidents over the, you know, just like the past few years alone, where this conversation very well could have taken shape the same way and gained the same momentum that it has as this time. Like I say, maybe the fact that pro sports is not happening right now to distract us from our everyday real lives, I think maybe is a factor in the conversation having so much momentum as it does now. The sports community really lending their voices, lots of pro athletes, current and former, sharing their experiences with racism, whether it was before their sports careers or right on through or right on after their sports careers. We've heard many different voices and many different accounts, and they're so needed. And so it's nice that everyone is kind of watching the same thing and paying attention to the same thing right now. And it really seems to be generating a lot of momentum with regards to taking action, not just saying words anymore, but actually putting real action into place to make our world, and not just obviously the sports world, but to make our world a more equal place and a more tolerant place. One of which, you know what, let's get into the sports headlines right now, because I think it's probably been a little too long since we heard this intro music.
Oh, yeah.
The headlines of the sports world, which, like we said, are pretty much all centered on what everyone is talking about now, the spark being the murder of George Floyd 2 weeks ago. Mike, take it away.
Yeah, and just sort of following off that, you're right. These movements are typically born out of something really tragic, something really unfortunate, something really awful, unjust. Eric Garner is a name that's still in everyone's head. That sort of spawned the whole "I Can't Breathe" movement, and Vanessa Bryant, posted a picture of her now deceased husband, Kobe Bryant, because that's the NBA community really rallied around that sort of phrase because, now in the age of social media, these actions are being caught on camera so much more than they were before. So it just makes you wonder to what extent this is actually going on. But these are horrific, gruesome, really just awful incidents that people are now maybe seeing for the first time. But I remember even now, that whole "I Can't Breathe" movement, where NBA players would wear shirts as a form of protest before a game, and now that's just as relevant now as it was a few years ago when he was killed at the hands of police as well. So sticking with the NBA Hall of Famer Michael Jordan and Jordan Brand have pledged to donate $100 million over 10 years to organizations dedicated to ensuring racial equality, social justice, and greater access to education. Nike also pledged $40 million to similar initiatives on behalf of itself, Jordan Brand, and Converse on Friday. In a statement, Jordan Brand said, "Until the ingrained racism that allows our country's institutions to fail is completely eradicated, we will remain committed to protecting and improving the lives of Black people," end quote.
Got to say, this is good to see from Nike because I'm sure you'll remember this, Mike. I think it was maybe last year or the year before, Nike released a new shoe, and the branding was basically centered around Colin Kaepernick and his kneeling during the American national anthem before NFL games to protest police brutality against the Black community, which seems like an eternity ago, but now has really come back into the focus because of the fact that that was the most significant recent peaceful protest that really got people riled up at the time. I'm sure you remember the conversation was often skewed by critics saying that Colin Kaepernick was disrespecting the troops or disrespecting the American flag, yada, yada, yada. And that was only perpetuated by the president of the United States himself, who took aim at Colin Kaepernick. He has not played an NFL game since being let go by the San Francisco 49ers. And that still remains a pretty hot topic of conversation to this day, that he essentially sacrificed his pro football career to protest police brutality against Black people. And that was, like we said, a peaceful protest. And now in the wake of the George Floyd murder, you've seen a lot of raw emotion come out of that has, in some cases, led to violent protests and riots and looting. And a lot of people saying, I don't like the looting. And it's like, well, yeah, that's fair enough. But you have to understand, just a few years ago, you had a problem with a very public, very peaceful protest. You didn't like that. So why do you think your opinion factors in when emotions are running hot and people don't know what to do now? A peaceful protest was condemned. You know, what are you supposed to do when you know things aren't right and that point needs to be made? It's so having said all that, it is nice to see. And when Nike came out with that campaign, it was panned as well from one side, people saying that, hey, they're using this un-American, unpatriotic guy and Colin Kaepernick and supporting that. The other side was also not totally supportive of it because it was like, you're profiting off of his protest, his protest against racial inequality. Like, really, Nike? Like, what do you? Yeah. Is that it came off as very tacky, on that side of things. So it's nice to see that they are as putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak.
Well, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing people with these larger platforms now. Probably few people with larger platforms than Michael Jordan, who has I think a net worth of something like over $2 billion now. So, and just with the timing of Last Dance coming out, which I think he is also committed to any portion that he receives from that. He's also committed to donating to some form of charitable organization. But someone with the platform and the resources and tools that he has to then turn that around and make this massive personal, but also brand donation to organizations that will further the agenda for organizations that are ensuring racial equality, social justice, greater access to education. That's the type of empowerment you want to see, and you want to see these organizations extend that arm to folks who need it, so that we can start to break down the ingrained racism that has unfortunately become rampant in the United States, and we're not immune from that as well. So great to see that platform. We'll obviously get to Drew Brees and the President of the United States, as well as Colin Kaepernick in a little bit as part of our next segment. But that sort of empowerment, if there is any type of silver lining to come out of these really, really unfortunate events, you are seeing this mobilization of resources and of voices to speak out and condemn these horrific racist acts. And it's like we were saying earlier with Eric Garner and George Floyd, like it feels like this really is a tipping point, when really some of those former cases should have been. But as you said, maybe with nothing going on in the sporting world now, people are cooped up as a result of the coronavirus. Now maybe there are fewer distractions going on, and this really feels like it's even more of a tipping point than some of those previous instances, which were just as horrific. But it feels like this one really, really has struck a nerve with a lot of people, and well beyond just the Black community too. There have been a lot of allies speaking out, and we'll touch on the Hockey Diversity Alliance later too. But one part of their ongoing efforts is to get prominent people in the white community, the Tom Bradys, the Sidney Crosbys, the Connor McDavids, to speak out about the forms of racism that they see their Black teammates or other league members endure, and to speak out against that hatred, so we can start to break down those walls.
And the more
good to see these types of contributions.
Yeah, absolutely. And the more I think about it, just while I was listening to you talk there, I was just like, it just kind of had a thought from last week's episode where one of the voices we heard from was Jalen Rose, and he had a particular quote that has really stuck with me ever since I put together that show last week, which was, "I wish America was." Now, let me just take a second to remember how it was. It was something, I wish that Americans were as in love with Black people as they are with Black culture. Or it was, I wish that America was as in love with Black people as it is with Black culture. And quite frankly, Nike as a corporation is a perfect example of that. When you think of Nike as a brand, obviously you think of sports, thus you think of professional athletes. And who are the first two names that probably come to your mind when you think of Nike as a brand synonymous with professional athletes? Michael Jordan, number one, Tiger Woods, number two. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure, there's a few others that would probably come after that, but when I think of it, those are the first two that come into my head. Those are both prominent Black athletes. And Nike is perhaps a perfect example of promoting themselves and their brand on Black culture and Black professional athletes. So Nike, as much as anyone, has profited off of Black culture, essentially. Yep. So, yeah, it really does feel like when you put it into that context, it really does feel like it is way overdue for Nike to start giving back to the black community with real consideration, with real, good sums of money. I mean, we all know Nike makes money hand over fist and has for the last 30 or so years. They have been the number one brand as far as North American sports apparel and most equipment goes. Definitely the biggest name, and have done that largely off promoting their brand off the backs of black athletes. So yeah, it does. Just thinking about that now and putting it in the context of what Jalen Rose said last week, it does really feel like, yeah, you know what, this is long overdue. Yeah,
and a nice sort of transition to Colin Kaepernick here, but I just wanted to touch on one last point that you made earlier about there being issue with these now non-peaceful protests, and these did start as peaceful protests, but now more than ever, people are turning to Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and posting what they're seeing in these protests. We saw even just weeks ago that, and it's a rhetoric thing. It's how people are responding to what they're seeing around them, and when you have someone in your Oval Office tweeting that white folks who are storming Capitol buildings with loaded assault rifles because they don't want to, they want to take America back. They want to take their masks off. They don't want to be cooped up in their house. Being referred to as people who are misunderstood right now. These are good people. They're frustrated.
Yeah.
And then when you have protests going on, protesting something much more legitimate in egregious racial inequality, they're referred to as thugs. But then, of course, if you do, like you said, demonstrate a peaceful protest like kneeling during a song, then that's not okay either. Yeah. My last point, I saw someone confronted on Twitter for holding that exact view, and someone said, so the Boston Tea Party, that was bad, right? They're like, well, no, it's because years and years of injustice was falling on deaf ears, so they had to mobilize and act
without a hint of irony in their voice. I'll bet.
Of course, yeah. It's like that's exactly what's going on before us. Let's transition now to Mr. Kaepernick. A day after apologizing for comments about NFL players engaging in peaceful protests, New Orleans Saints quarterback Drew Brees is defending his newfound stance to the President of the United States. Donald Trump criticized Brees late last week for walking back comments he made about kneeling during the national anthem. Brees, who faced backlash from other athletes for saying he would never agree with anyone disrespecting the flag of the United States, has since acknowledged that protests initiated by Colin Kaepernick in the NFL were never about the Stars and Stripes.
I would like to follow that up and say that, hey, you know what? If Drew Brees can change his mind about this type of thing, then anyone can. Unfortunately, I don't know if that's quite realistic. However, very encouraging to see. And Drew Brees was very adamant about this, that he was passionate in that stance, and he fully believed that Colin Kaepernick's protest, along with a lot of other people, felt that it was a disrespectful gesture or act to, like we alluded to earlier, the American military, armed forces in general, and the American flag. That was never what it was about. I think you and I know that. I think most people who were supportive of Colin Kaepernick weren't supportive of him because they were saying, yeah, to hell with the flag. No, they were doing it because they knew what the protest was actually about. There were many members of the American Armed Forces who came out themselves in support of Colin Kaepernick and said that this is not about the flag. This is not about disrespecting the troops. This is about protesting police brutality against the black community. And if members of the troops were saying that, it just boggled my mind that people could still have this ignorant, narrow-minded view and think that must be what he's doing. Therefore, he is he's an awful person. He should be out of the league. It does, obviously, it reminds you of the kind of power and influence that the president of the United States has, and how that can be potentially dangerous and can affect people the way they think in different ways. But at the very least, it is encouraging to see that minds can be changed. And I think at the end of the day, that is a starting point for this whole conversation.
Yeah, just even before hopping on this show, Lecter, I was reading, because this is continually evolving, right? So since those comments, Drew Brees obviously walked them back, and for right reason. They have nothing to do with the flag of the United States. A lot of his reasoning probably had to do with the fact that he got absolutely blasted on social media. LeBron James, the most critical against what he had to say. His own teammates, his own black teammates, who he will now have to face whenever training camp gets underway for hopefully the start of a regular NFL season, but we'll see. And other NFL players and other very prominent black sports figures across all major sports in the United States. So he had to walk them back, I think, because he was absolutely blasted. But good to see that he is listening now to those closest to him, but other black athletes as well. He has walked those comments back. NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell has come out condemning any forms of racial intolerance. I think that it wasn't quite as hard a stance as people might have wanted initially. So he then came out with a second statement, to which, of course, the President of the United States also had to get a piece of, recently tweeting. I saw it just before we were hopping on this show. Tweeting at Mr. Goodell if he's now asking people to kneel during the anthem. So, we're still in the midst of a global pandemic. We're now in the midst of a very real movement towards getting rid of racial intolerance and at least addressing all the injustices that community faces. And we still have the President of the United States tweeting about kneeling during football games. So still, some people don't like the peaceful protests, but they don't like when they get even more frustrated and we have protests that do turn somewhat violent. So I don't really know what they're searching for. Well,
and it just goes to show that the conversation was never really had, perhaps specifically in NFL locker rooms. I don't know when that was the entire focus of the NFL season, pretty much from start to finish, was Colin Kaepernick's protest, and basically I think that was probably when they had their highest ratings, was when the national anthem was happening, because people just wanted to see who else was going to kneel and what players' reactions was going to be. Then there were some players who just were staying in the locker room because Roger Goodell had come out and said that players would face disciplinary action for kneeling during the national anthem. So players responded to that by just staying in the dressing room until the anthem was played, and then they would come out. And that went on and on and on. And you got to wonder what was actually being talked about, aside from actual football, in the locker rooms. Because if Drew Brees is sitting beside one of these teammates that now came out and criticized him for his recent comments about, that he would never support kneeling during the anthem, what I can't imagine how that never would have come up. Like, I get it. You're there to play football. You're there to win football games. But how does an elephant that big potentially in the room not get addressed then? I'm happy it's getting addressed now. And clearly Drew Brees has had his eyes opened by the conversations that he has had with his own teammates. But it honestly boggles my mind that not a word of this was perhaps spoken before now. Mm-hmm.
And certainly a prominent member of, a position that is traditionally occupied, or certainly a lot of the Hall of Fame legendary quarterbacks have been white. Probably the GOAT in Tom Brady and Drew Brees. So these guys have these platforms. So it would be good for them amongst all the others to be speaking out against these prejudices. Like you said, for Colin Kaepernick, he really did end up sacrificing his National Football League career to put a spotlight on police brutality and police violence. And ever since, he's been completely blackballed by the NFL, completely ostracized from the community, alienated, and hasn't had a contract since. And certainly it has absolutely nothing to do with stats or QB ratings, because he was among the top when he was still active. So that political statement that he made was apparently too much, and for that reason he wasn't able to secure any contracts afterwards. When we're talking about what this movement has really created, it goes so much beyond words, and it is good to see that there are folks maybe changing their views. The charitable donations like the one the Jordan brand made, which we alluded to earlier. But another story I saw late last night is that the Minneapolis City Council is now, I believe, in serious conversations of disbanding its policing force.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be, a transformative move, something I can't even imagine what it would look like. But we're not talking defunding immediately, but at least reallocating funds to other community-based partners or organizations or divisions where groups could be empowered, and it's not just this police force. It's not at the same time some descent into anarchy where it's lawless and without justice or reform or anything like that. But that is something I think it was 9 out of 13 councillors have already agreed upon, which would make it veto proof. But these are the kind of conversations that have been initiated now, because finally people are realizing that this is a serious problem, and it's going to take a whole lot more than words to work things out.
Absolutely. You alluded to the NHL and the formation of a racism coalition to focus on that. We've heard a lot about and I mean, even just before COVID, we heard from Akeem Alou. The Brian Peters situation, him getting removed from the Calgary Flames bench. What's going on there, Mike?
Yeah, so a number of current and former NHL players of color have formed the Hockey Diversity Alliance in an attempt to eradicate racism and intolerance in the sport, led by San Jose Sharks forward Evander Kane and former Calgary Flame Akeem Aliu. The organization said it would strive to be a force for positive change, not only within hockey, but society. The Alliance also has plans to launch a charitable division sometime soon.
I don't know if you saw this or not, but I was reading about this on TSN, just before we started doing the show here. Kevin Weeks has apparently spoken out against the GTHL, which stands for the Greater Toronto Hockey League. Apparently, So basically he's been an analyst with TSN for, I can't even remember how many years it's been now, but he's been out of the league for a number of years, had an 11-year career in the NHL, and has been pretty much with TSN, I believe, ever since. He's done work for CBC. He's actually turned into a pretty good broadcaster since the end of his pro career. But he had a statement against the Greater Toronto Hockey League, because apparently there has been multiple incidents of racism and racial slurs being hurled during games. And I guess this has been a big enough thing where several players, Kevin Weeks and Chris Stewart of the Philadelphia Flyers, have both come out publicly to put pressure on the GTHL to disclose just how many incidents it has been. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've heard of similar incidents throughout Western Canada. I remember there was one. There was a really serious one in Quebec. at a tournament a few years ago. And through the last few years, there have been stories that have come out about racism and racial slurs being used during hockey games. We know that hockey is certainly not immune to this sort of thing, and if anything, just quite the opposite. It has been pointed to directly as a league that has a very serious racism problem. Most recently, as we alluded to, the Akeem Alou story with being formerly coached by Brian Peters, who was the former coach of the Calgary Flames, has since been removed from that position due to pretty serious allegations from several years ago.
Yeah.
But Kevin Weeks has essentially now said that he is not going to talk about the GTHL anymore on TSN or just publicly at all, because they put out a statement saying that they would not release this information. So apparently they do have a collected, it seems this way anyway, that they do have collected data of racist incidents that have occurred in the league over the past couple seasons, but they don't want to release it, I guess because they don't want to look bad, but really keeping that so quiet when that kind of information and exposing that, not necessarily who's said it. Like, I mean, these are kids essentially. They're, throughout their teens, they're still they're still figuring out who they are. You don't necessarily want to make that their identities public or anything like that. But I think it's important, certainly to the conversation that we're all having now, to know just how deep this problem runs, and so Kevin Weeks has been very vocal about that. So it'll be interesting to see how that situation unfolds. But getting back to the Hockey Diversity Alliance, very cool to see that some players are bonding together and decided that it's time to face this situation head on, and hockey's particular problem with racism.
Yeah, and really prominent players too, both current and former. You'd be pretty hard pressed, I bet, to find any person of color trying to break through to the next level in hockey, whether it be in Canada or the United States, that hasn't faced at least some form of racial intolerance or prejudice just because of the color of their skin. There have been a lot of talk about, meanwhile, in Canada, well, things aren't that much better here if you're a person of color. They may not be quite as bad as they are in the United States, but certainly anyone who is a visible person of color at some form or another has dealt with racism, whether directly or indirectly. And a sport like hockey, which is so white dominated, a lot of white North American, a lot of European players, that path to the big league would be even very much different from a path in the NBA and the NFL, which is predominantly played by black professional athletes. So even more amplified, I think, in the National Hockey League, where it is again a very predominantly white sport. And we've heard even as recently as this year with hockey's reckoning, some of these stories and not even that long ago are now coming to light. The people closest to the sport know that there's a problem with racism and intolerance. So initiatives like this, and especially as they get ready to launch a charitable division, hopefully this can help in the fight to eradicate racism in hockey.
Whew. All right. That's a lot of heavy stuff. Let's take a quick break and come back and talk about what has become the lighter side of pro sports. How are we dealing with COVID? Next on Cabin Sports Radio.
The Cabin Sports Radio podcast, brought to you by Sport North, moving sport forward.
Welcome back to Cabin Sports Radio, brought to you by Sport North. Check out sportnorth.com for more. And if you head to sportnorth.com right now and you are perhaps a coach, well, some pretty cool stuff up there for you now that you may want to know more about. Go to sportnorth.com, click on coaching, and then click on the coaching courses tab, and you will find 4 courses down in the upcoming courses section. Coaching and leading effectively, which is actually it actually runs tomorrow, June 9th to June 13th. Psychology of Performance, which happens June 10th. Advanced Practice Plan, June 15th. And Planning a Practice, June 23rd to June 24th. Check out sportnorth.com/coaching for more on that. And if you have any questions, you can get in touch. Go to sportnorth.com to contact them as well for more information on that. All right, Mike. So COVID-19 and how that has affected pro sports. Shockingly, despite the amount of damage that it's done to certain leagues and how it has just made things kind of crazy for everyone. Surprisingly, playing second fiddle compared to what is going on around the world. But here we are still addressing it. And one sport that we haven't talked a whole lot about and what they are thinking, where they're heading, is Major League Baseball. What's going on in the MLB, Mike?
That's right. Major League Baseball is proposing a 76-game season and an expanded playoff field as it tries to get the 2020 season off the ground as early as July. The latest proposal would also allow players to earn up to 75% of their prorated salaries. Even with a proposed shortened season, MLB officials figure league revenues will drop from close to $10 billion to $2.75 billion. Talks between the league and Players Association are ongoing.
Only $2.75 billion. How will they make ends meet?
Well, I remember when we were talking earlier, and I think it was the NBA estimates that around 40% of all league revenues come from people in seats. So at live games, that's an estimated 40% of their revenues.
I'm actually shocked it's that high. I'm not going to lie.
Well, right, like especially with television deals, with merchandise, and the NBA especially has made great steps in recent years to really globalize the game. They're in markets all over the world, and merch sales are continuing to go up. It occupies an interesting fraction of their overall league revenues. The MLB is different, and I don't know if it's in terms of how their stars are promoted. I imagine merch sales would probably be just pretty comparable to NBA merch sales, but their league revenues from people in seats are much higher, and some of the ballparks in the United States can fit upwards of 70,000 people for one game. So that aspect is obviously completely removed, and no matter what league you are right now, any return to play scenarios will involve no fans, at least for the immediate situation. So but kind of hearing from the players union that this is actually a worse deal than the one that was offered previously, and it has to do with the guaranteed salary, prorated salary, and the percentage, and what the implications are for playoffs. So then players would be entitled to more of their salaries, but it comes down to risk mitigation efforts, and I think you're probably going to have the players union take this back to the players, and they'll reject this. So we're looking at we're already down from 162 games to a potential 76 game season, and I know that on the league side of things, they'd like to push things forward as soon as possible, and I think I read in one report that they basically want an answer as early as Wednesday, but I think the early thinking is because of the amount of risk that the players would have to take on, and with a smaller guaranteed portion of their prorated salaries, it just doesn't seem that palatable right now for the players. So I imagine it would be rejected pretty quickly, and then we're kind of back at ground zero. But it sounds like, compared to previous offers, this one pales in comparison. So we could be at a stalemate for a little bit here. But I remember, when we were talking about the potential suspension of play in the middle of the season, obviously very tough for the NBA and the NHL, the
Right.
NFL. They're still months away from training camp at the time, so they could sit at least a little bit more comfortably than some of these other leagues. But I remember at the time thinking, as far as Major League Baseball is concerned, they've got to be more concerned than anyone. They haven't even got underway yet as they're preparing for the 2020 season, and we're already 2.5 months behind schedule already. Yeah. So, and the window is just getting shorter and shorter for a possible 2020 season to kick off.
Yeah, you know what? I'm not going to lie. When all is said and done, if I was going to put money on something with regards to the MLB season, I think I would actually put money on the season just being scrapped entirely.
Yeah.
Like I don't know. Like I don't know how you get around that. I mean, obviously the owners are going to want prorated salaries, but obviously the players know that like they're really, aside from the league basically having to work to put together a schedule, there's not a whole lot else going on other than the actual games themselves. Especially if they presumably, which they would, I assume, go to the hub city format that the NBA and the NHL have been looking at for finishing off their season in playoffs. The players are more, like, it sounds weird to say because they're always front and center, but they're essentially more front and center than they ever have been. And so they're like, well, why should we lose more of our cut? It just, it's interesting. And I would bet it's, as it so often does in American professional sports, it all comes down to money. And I would not be surprised if they just scrap the season entirely.
And, we've even heard here that a lot of health officials are predicting a second and perhaps even more extreme wave of COVID-19 in the fall. And we're so used to watching the Fall Classic, October baseball. So that is a very genuine concern now, too, as we continue to push the season back. Now you've got teams playing into the latter portion of the fall where there is fear that there could be a second, even more extreme wave of COVID-19. So talks still progressing, but at the present time, it doesn't seem like they're going over that well. We will wrap things up, or shift gears at least, to the NBA, which has approved a 22-team format to resume the 2019-2020 season on July 31st in Orlando. Under the plan, 13 Western Conference and 9 Eastern Conference teams will play 8 regular season seeding games, a potential play-in tournament for the 8th seed, and then playoffs at the Walt Disney World Resort. Teams are scheduled to begin training in Florida as early as July 9th.
That's it's an interesting format, doing the hub cities and then just having the entire playoffs played at the Walt Disney World Resort. I'm sure there's probably a few NHL players thinking like, are we going to swing something like that? Because that'd be okay. I'd be all right with that. Better than hanging out in Edmonton, I guess, for
right
for a couple weeks.
I caught myself kind of chuckling when I had heard that the NBA had initiated talks with the Walt Disney company for potential playing scenarios in at the World Resort, and now that has come to fruition. That is where the season will resume. So it's kind of like when you've got like the World Cup of FIFA or the Euro Cup.
Yeah,
you'll have the different groups, and there's always that group of death, right, where you've got like the Belgiums and the Germanys or the Brazils, like the really the best in the world in terms of soccer. That's sort of like that was, I think, a little bit of the inspiration and motivation for resuming play. So that is something that I think is still being tossed around, is then to have these remaining 22 teams broken off into groups where they'll play these regular season seeding games, is what they're called. And then taking those 8 games plus your regular season record through the course of the season that was already played, then reseed everyone in time for the expanded playoff format. And I think the potential play-in tournament would just be for that 8th and final seed in each conference. So I don't know if that means that they're doing away, because we were talking before about the conference lists setup for they would just seed 1 through 16 regardless of what conference you're in.
Yeah.
Now I think what they're doing is leaning more towards this group stage seeding round robin, if you will, before breaking off into the actual expanded playoff format. So one last thing that I heard is that this is all to appease the New Orleans Pelicans, who of course have rookie sensation Zion Williamson.
Right.
So at the right at the time that the season was suspended, the Pelicans were making a playoff push. I believe they were in either the 9th or 10th spot out west, but were making a little bit of a push. So there are a lot of executives and certainly insiders who think that was sort of the motivation for this style to resume the season, is that like the cutoff line would be the New Orleans Pelicans, just so that people could see more of Zion Williamson and the Pelicans. But it gives those bubble teams a chance, right?
That's right.
Like, a lot of teams were dealing with injuries. The Raptors certainly not immune to that. So it gives those teams a little bit more of a chance. And I think the final vote was 29-1. And interestingly enough, the one team was Portland, who is in the playoff mix. They wouldn't be one of the 8 teams who wouldn't be playing regardless.
What's that problem?
Well, I think it had to do again with risk, and then there's something about how this will all affect the draft lottery as well.
Okay.
And I guess their collective team went forward to ownership and announced that was an issue, a concern for them, and they gave him kudos for having a backbone and delivering that one single negative vote. So something to do with how it would affect their draft odds. But then I guess just in terms of where they are positionally, they didn't think it would benefit them as opposed to the traditional 1 through 8 seeding in each conference format. So I think that was the reason for the nay.
Okay. Well, there's always got to be a little bit of controversy.
Oh, that's right.
There's always got to be a conspiracy theory floating around there somewhere. So we've checked all the boxes. Good to see that the NBA is working just as hard as anyone else to finish off the 2020. Well, 2019. 2019 seems so long ago.
I know.
But the 2019-2020 regular season and NBA playoffs. Similarly, the NHL looking, as we've talked about quite a bit, a 24-team format that seems to be getting the absolute go-ahead. Still talk, no official word about what those hub cities will be. As far as Canadian cities, the last I saw is Vancouver, Edmonton, and Toronto are still in the mix. So we'll have to see how it plays out there. Gary Bettman did say, I believe last week, that the NHL training camps, which they are going to do before essentially the Stanley Cup tournament kicks off, are going to start no sooner than July 1st. So kind of nice, too, that the NBA and the NHL, they're always about a little over a week apart as far as when their conclusions happen. So they're staying right in step there. So good to hear that, as long as things keep going ahead as they are, and even despite the fact that we heard a story about an unnamed Pittsburgh Penguins player who apparently tested positive for COVID-19, that doesn't seem to be phasing anyone. Apparently he is possibly has recovered already. But that didn't seem to throw a wrench in any plans. So, well, if that doesn't, then I'm not sure what would at this point. But so turning to the CFL, another league that has found itself with a big old question mark over its head. Still no absolute final answer as to whether or not we will be seeing some semblance of a 2020 CFL season. The last we've heard is potentially starting on Labor Day weekend and having a 9-week abbreviated regular season. There's been talk about hub cities as well. Most of that is centered around Winnipeg, Regina, and Edmonton as well. I think all of the cities, and actually there was one, I heard there was a city that doesn't actually have a CFL team that has put in a bid to be a hub city too. I would have to guess that would be Saskatoon, but I don't actually know for sure. So we'll see how that all plays out as well with the CFL, but them as well as pretty much every other major sports franchise putting out or sports league rather, putting out a statement and making their stance clear with regards to the ongoing conversation about racial equality in our lives. There was some really good interviews that TSN did with former CFL quarterbacks Warren Moon and Kahari Jones on their experiences living and enduring racism. Here is Warren Moon.
When we talk to a number of American players that come up and play in the Canadian Football League, the one thing that really stands out is they say when they come here, they feel safer. Now, certainly, Canada's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
But can you take us back to some of the incidents maybe you had to deal with growing up and how you felt it was different when you came?
Well, I grew up, I was part of I wasn't part of it, but I was during the time of the Watts riots, which was in Los Angeles, California. And it ended up ending the riots about maybe 4 or 5 blocks from where I live. So it was moving towards my neighborhood. But I watched everything on television. I was 10 years old at the time. And I remember taking my bicycle wheel that needed air in the tire, taking it down the hill from where I lived to the main street where the gas station was so I could put air in the tire. And I see this Jeep with a huge machine gun on the back with 3 soldiers on there in full uniforms, full strapped bullets and everything, and watching every car that went by. And that's how serious it was, because they had brought in the military and the National Guard for the riot. So that's something that is still etched in my mind as a 10-year-old walking down the street just to get some air in my tire, but having to deal with seeing that type of military action out there. So I've lived through that. I was alive when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and I saw how that touched my mom, and how because she actually went to school with him, and she was at Spelman and he was at Morris Brown, and she knew him. And then I've been through all of the different tragedies that have happened, the Rodney King beating that also caused murders. So all of those things I've been privy to, and I've even had my own personal incidents with the police. And even though I'm more of a privileged African American because I have some notoriety, when they pulled me over, they didn't know who I was. All they saw was a black guy in a nice car, and they wanted to know, first off, how can you afford a car like this? Until they saw my license, my license, and saw who I was, and all of a sudden their whole attitude changed. So I can just imagine African Americans and people of color out there that don't have the privilege, that don't have a little bit of notoriety, how they're treated by policemen sometimes when they're pulled over. I'm not saying that there's not a lot of good policemen out there, because there are. I know there's a lot of good ones because I've met a lot of them. I was coached by policemen when I was a Pop Warner player playing football growing up, and I had tremendous respect for policemen. But there's a lot of bad ones in the force too, and those bad ones need to be weeded out. They need to be punished. They need to lose their jobs, and they need to be prosecuted for some of the things that they do to people over and over.
That's legendary former CFL and NFL quarterback Warren Moon speaking with TSN's Farhan Lalji about his lived experiences with racism. Kahari Jones, former quarterback of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers and now head coach of the Montreal Alouettes, also had a pretty strong statement about what was going on with regards to the fallout after the George Floyd murder. Here is Kahari Jones speaking with TSN about his lived experiences with racism.
I felt pretty fortunate growing up in California, and I grew up around a lot of races and no major issues, but yeah, me and my friends, I think I was in college or just after college, and we were put on the ground, handcuffed, and they drew their guns. And it was a case of mistaken identity, but, we we called it at the time, being black while walking, because that's just something things that have happened with people that you knew. And it happened to me. About 4 or 5 of my friends, my brother was there. And it was, it's a horrible feeling. It's a horrible feeling to be kind of pointed out for something like that. And it's not even, and even in Canada to a certain extent, and Canada is, believe me, much, much better, and I feel much better than of the social climate, but there's still issues that I haven't said much about this. I wrote a letter to the players and let them know. But when I was a quarterback at Winnipeg, I received death threats, because my wife is a different color than me, and we had police officers staying at our house, kind of patrolling our house while I was away at away games, and there were a series of letters, and I still have those letters, and it's just a reminder, that things aren't always great, and it could have been just one person, but one is still too many, and just to do that on the basis of a person's skin color is horrible.
There's Kahari Jones, former quarterback of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, talking about his experience before playing in the CFL, dealing with racism, and his experience even during his time up here in Canada, playing for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers and experiencing racism. Now, those two players played about the 20 or so years apart, and experience things that nobody should have to experience all the same. And 20 or so years later, here we are still dealing with these issues that we would all so like to think and so wish that we were so far past, but we obviously are not. And I think for me, Mike, I just want to say certainly thank you to those who continue to tell their story and share their voice. And for those of us who are in a position of privilege, who do not have to deal with racism in their daily lives, we owe it to them to listen and to believe their stories.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, we are going to end with another powerful piece that Mike pointed me to. The Toronto Raptors put together a statement of their own with regards to what's going on. They put together a beautiful poem called I Can't Breathe. We are going to finish that off with tonight's episode of Cabin Sports Radio. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Cabin Sports Radio, brought to you by Sport North. We will be back next week talking more sports. See you then.
I can't breathe.
It's a simple phrase.
I can't breathe.
A little plea that prays.
I can't breathe.
A call to recognize.
I can't breathe. The fear that's in my eyes. I can't breathe.
I can't breathe.
One man's life.
When the sidewalk shut.
I can't breathe.
Ended by a knee on the neck.
I can't breathe.
Look around at those you see.
I can't breathe.
See yourself as you see me.
I can't breathe.
If I am the next to die.
I can't breathe.
Ask yourself the reason
why.
Let's all breathe.
Let's all breathe. Let's all rise above.
Let's all breathe.
With newfound hope and unbound love.
Unbound love.
newfound love.
With newfound hope.
and unbound love.
We need action. I promise we will take action.